just gonna be me here alone. Oh, we got some people joining. Bella, look, got people looking at us. Say hi. I just want them back. I just want them to come back. And if they're not safe right now, that's what's tearing me apart. Because if they are safe, they're coming back. But if they're not, this has got to stop. Like, somebody has to come forward.
Girls.
Oh, CC Bella.
Okay. You want chocolate? No chocolate? Hey, if you want chocolate, you just get this bowl. You want this one, bigger one? We're gonna go.
I love you too.
This is the morning. This is why I love that I thrive.
Objectively say that this is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. And nothing less than a maximum sentence would be appropriate. And anything less than the maximum sentence would depreciate the seriousness of this offense. Deputies, I would respectfully ask that you take this defendant into custody and have him serve the rest of his life in the Department of Corrections. We are in recess.
If this stillness holds you, a quiet gesture helps sustain these long-form investigations. Taking a moment to like the video or subscribe allows stories like this to be examined with the time and care they demand, bringing hidden truths into focus, one layer at a time.
I don't want to be in it. Get lower.
I wanted to say thank you for this moment. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has prayed for our beloved family, who has sent gifts, cards to us from all over the world. I know God will put the evil people where they need to be. I also want to take the time to thank the town of Frederick, Greeley, FBI, the DA's office, the CBI, for exceptional work. We thank Nicole Atkinson, Shannon's neighbor, Nathan, and his family. To me, they're our heroes. They really are. God bless. God makes no mistakes on who he puts in your life. Marriage is about love, trust, and friendship and unity. We marry for sickness and health, to death do us part. Our daughter Shannon loved you with all of her heart. Your children loved you to the moon and back. Shannon's family was her world. Shannon put a crown on your head. But unfortunately, the day that you took their life, God removed that crown. We loved you like a son. We trusted you. Your faithful wife trusted you. Your children adored you, and they also trusted you. Your daughter Bella Marie sang a song proudly. And I don't know if you got to see it, but it was, "Daddy, you're my hero." I have no idea who gave you the right to take their lives. But I know God and his mighty angels were there at that moment to bring them home to paradise. God gives us free will. So not only did you take the family of four, your family of four, you took your own life. I want the world to know that our daughter and her children were so loved by us. There will always be protected by God and his mighty angels. I didn't want death for you because that's not my right. Your life is between you and God now, and I pray that he has mercy for you. From Shannon's mother, Bella Marie, Celeste Catherine, and Nico Lee's Nana. Thank you, Your Honor.
Position of trust with respect to the victim in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection F. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Count 5 alleges murder in the first degree, a Class 1 felony. It alleges that between and including August 12th, 2018 and August 13th, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts unlawfully, feloniously, and knowingly caused the death of Celeste Watts, a child who had not yet attained 12 years of age, and the defendant was in a position of trust with respect to the victim in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection F. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
With regard to these first 5 counts, the minimum sentence that the court could impose if convicted is life imprisonment in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and the maximum sentence is death. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Let me also point out that pursuant to Rule 32.1 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure,
Tell them you love them.
You're welcome. We love you.
Say love
Get your
you.
candy.
Oh yeah, shoot, that's in here.
What I'd like to say to the court is that Shannon, Bella, and Nico are loving, caring people. They love life. They love being around people who love them. They always had good times. This is the first time they went to the beach this year, and they loved it. But God only knows what happened that night. Life will never be the same without Shannon, Bella, and Celeste, and Nico. Had all their lives to live. They were taken by a heartless one. This is the heartless one, the evil monster, who dare you take the lives of my daughter Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. And they also trusted you. The heartless monster, and then you take them out like trash. You disgust me. They were loving and caring people. You may have taken their bodies from me, but you will never take the love they had for me. They loved us more than you will ever know, because you don't know what love is, because if you did, you would not have killed them. You monster, thought you would get away with this. I don't know how. The cameras do not lie. You carry them out like trash of the house. Yes, I seen the videotape. You buried my daughter Shannon and Nico in a shallow grave, and then you put Bella and Celeste in huge containers of crude oil. You heartless monster. You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see that every time you close your eyes at night. Oh, I forgot. You have no heart or feelings or love. Let me tell you something. I will think of them every day of my life, and I love them every day of my life. Prison is too good for you. This is hard to say, but may God have mercy on your soul. I hope you enjoy your new life. It's nothing like the one you had out here. May the courts have no mercy on you. It's hard every day. It hurts in so many ways. I have heard people say that you're not a monster. No, you are not. You're an evil monster. Thank you. Love you, Shannon, Bella, and Nico. Love you, Pop Up and Dad. And one other thing. And Shannon says she is super excited for justice today. Thank you, Your Honor.
I don't want them to really go in the ocean. I mean,
Ready, set? Ready, set?
The pool opens in 2 weeks too.
what's the degrees today?
85 last I checked. 120.
Wow.
No, CC.
Yeah. Cece, get girl. Oh God. Oh my gosh, are you kidding? She can climb that fence.
The past 3 months I barely slept because I've been going through a lot of different emotions because I did not see this coming. You went from being my brother, my sister's protector, one of the most loved people in my family, to someone I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand. What gave you the right to put your hands on a woman, let alone my best friend, my beloved sister, your daughters, and your son? Why weren't they enough for you? In the blink of an eye, you took away my whole world, the people that mattered to me the most. Everything in my life I loved, your children. They trusted you. They loved you. They looked up to you because you promised to keep them safe. Instead, you turned on your family. My blood is boiling as I write these last words because they are the last you will ever hear from me. I can't even think of the right words to describe the betrayal and the hate I feel. And to be honest, you aren't even worth the time and effort it takes to put my pen to this paper. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't cry for my family. They were my whole world. All I do is ask myself why. Why would you do this? You don't deserve to be called a man. What kind of person slaughters the people that love them the most? Did you really think you would get away with this? Did you really think that this was your best option, to throw away your family like they were garbage? They deserve better, and you know it. I hope you spend the rest of your life staring at the ceiling every night, being haunted by what you've done. None of us deserved this. Hearing my mother and father cry themselves to sleep in this hotel room causes me anguish that is beyond words. I can't describe how this feels, how badly my heart is breaking for my poor parents. We trusted you. You have taken away my family from this earth, but you can never take them from my heart. You took away my privilege of being an uncle to the most precious little girls I've ever known. I will never hear the words Uncle Frankie again, but you will never be called Dad again either. You'll never be able to put your hands on another woman, let alone my best friend, my beloved sister, and your son. I just can't comprehend how they weren't enough for you. Shanann, Bella, and Cece loved you more than anyone. You were their hero. How could you destroy the people who loved them the most? I pray that you never have a moment's peace or a good night's rest in the cage you'll spend every day of your life in. A cage you are privileged to live in because my family isn't evil like you. We begged the district attorney to spare your life because despite everything, we believe that no one has the right to take the life of another, even someone like you. I feel sorry for your family. I know the pain that they must feel knowing that they can't hug you, because that's how my mother, father, and I feel every time we cry for our family. Nothing hurts more than watching or hearing my family weep for their loved ones. I just wish that I could tell that you would tell the truth, but I know that that is asking for more than you are capable of. I stayed up all night writing this statement. I don't sleep because of you. My life will never be the same because of you, but at least my conscience is clear. I get to live free, but I can't say the same for you. I haven't slept in 2 days because I've been anxiously waiting for this moment, the moment I get to tell you how I feel, how this has affected my family and I. My family and I can finally grieve after today. If anything, we will come out of this stronger today than we were before, and we will continue to pray for your family. Sincerely, Frankie Rusick.
Thank you.
Cece, play patty cake on Daddy's head.
Yeah, she's gripping it right now.
Cece, play patty cake on Daddy's head. Go whack it, Daddy.
Don't do that, Cece. Don't do it. Sounds kind of hollow.
Whack it, Daddy. Don't spit.
Don't spit on Daddy, please. Oh, that's a shower.
Careful, Bella, don't fall, okay? Whack it, Daddy. Whack it, Daddy. One more time, Daddy. Whack it, Daddy. Whack.
I'm Cindy Watts.
Ron Watson.
Thank you. And I have authorized you to make a statement to the court as paternal grandparents of the children. And if you choose not to make a statement, but your designee, Ms. Powers, chooses to, she can do so as well. How would you like to proceed
Can
today?
I read that? I want you to start. I would like to read
Who's
that.
going to be speaking today?
Your Honor, initially, They've asked me, and they're hoping that they have the strength to speak, but if they do not, they've written out their statements and asked me to finish for them. So
That would be fine. Who would like to go first?
if I could start, Your Honor. On behalf of the Watts, Your Honor, and to the community, we thank you for the opportunity and the recognition under the Victim Bill of Rights. We come today as the grandparents and the parent of the daughter and children whose life was taken in this case. We are not here to ask for leniency. We are not in any way condoning or tolerating the crime that has occurred and the pain that has been caused. We join in our daughter-in-law and grandchildren's family in saying this should never have happened. This is not condonable. This is something that we will never get over. We appreciate the consideration that everyone has paid, most especially the families that have lost everyone. We appreciate that they begged for Christopher's life. We agree and echo what they have said, that it is not his place to take anyone's life, nor would it be our place as a community to take his life. So we thank you for the opportunity and for every consideration and effort that's been put out. The prosecution in this case has in fact respected the Victim Bill of Rights. They took the time to explain that the information that my clients had at the time that they were interviewed was not correct. They were misinformed. They were searching for answers. They were not intending to cause any pain to anyone, and they appreciate that the prosecution answered their questions and gave them the time and the respect and the consideration so that they could tell this court and everyone in this community that the interview content was not their message, that they accept that their son has done this, that they accept that he chose to plead guilty, that he sought and requested their consent and agreement for a life sentence. They appreciate that he is given the opportunity to serve that life sentence. It is his responsibility, it is his sentence, and it is not enough to make up for what has done. We understand and we join the family in that we have questions. We don't know how such a thing could possibly happen, or that a man that was responsible for raising his children and protecting his wife would take the steps that he did, and that he would disregard their bodies and the love that he had for them and they had for him and everyone else, and take the gestures and put this community through the investigation and the discovery and the responsibility of bringing justice. We do not understand that. We do not think it was appropriate. We cannot begin to think that an explanation will ever justify it. My clients indicate that they understand that a full opportunity for a confession with all of the responsibility and accountability has not occurred. And they support the family and the request that that happen, if not today, at an appropriate time, in an appropriate manner, so that everyone can have peace, to understand to the best of their ability the details that they need and to have their questions answered. And by giving this opportunity of a life sentence, we hope that he embraces that moment. That had the death penalty been pursued, there would not have been an opportunity to be accountable and to give a full confession. And had the death penalty been sought, counsel would have fought for his life, the prosecutors would have been engaged in a multiple-year battle, the families would have been torn apart, this community would have had to subsidize it and endure it, and we have so much respect and gratefulness that that did not happen. We would strongly encourage Christopher Watts to give that full confession in the tone and in the timing that he thinks is appropriate with the guidance of his counsel. We feel that it would be appropriate and helpful to ease the pain and the suffering. But we also say we don't think that there's anything that he can say that will ever account for his behavior. There's nothing that can be done to cure the harm he has caused. And he has the responsibility to serve his sentence with dignity and with regard for everyone, and to spend every breath that he has left in an atonement for what he has done. Do you want to read it?
So if I could just have you state your name for the record.
Cindy Watts.
Thank you.
My name is Cindy Watts. I am the grandmother of two beautiful granddaughters, Bella Marie, Celeste Catherine Watts. I am also the mother of Christopher Watts, who I will be directing most of my statement to. First, I'd like to begin by recognizing the absolute horror of this crime and acknowledging the devastating loss that both the Rusek family as well as our family have faced. Our families have been irreparably broken by the needless deaths of Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico. This is something we will never get over. We will always mourn the loss of our family, and in that, we are united in our grief. I am still struggling to understand how and why this tragedy occurred. I may never be able to understand and accept it, but I pray for peace and healing for all of us. Now to my son Christopher. I have known you since the day you were born into this world. I have watched you grow from a quiet and sweet, curious child who Bella reminded me so much of, to a young man who worked hard in sports and later mechanics to achieve your goals. You are a good friend, brother, father, and son. We have loved you from the beginning, and we still love you now. This might be hard for some to understand, how I can sit here under these circumstances and tell you, although we are heartbroken, although we can't imagine what could have led us to this day, but we love you. Maybe you can't believe it either. As the Lord said in Jeremiah 3:31, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I have continued my faithfulness to you. And you, as your mother, Chris, I have always loved you, and I still do. I hate what has happened. Your father and sister and I are struggling to understand why. But we will remain faithful as your family, just as God remains faithful because of his unconditional love for us all. We love you, and we forgive you, son.
Thank you.
Judge, if I could read Mr. Watts' statement.
Yes.
My name is Ronnie Watts, and I am the grandfather of Bella, Celeste, Nico Watts, and I am the father of Shannon. I am the father of Christopher Watts as well. And one of the most important things I've done in my life is to raise my children and to watch as they started their own families. I spent many years coaching Little League and talking to my son, taking him to the races, and sharing my love and knowledge of cars with him. He was just as involved with his girls. I believe he loves his girls. I know he does. This tragedy has impacted my family in so many ways. Beyond losing my precious grandchildren, our beloved daughter-in-law, we are forced to question everything. We still don't have all the answers, and I hope one day, Christopher, you can help us. Chris, I want to talk to you as a father and son. You are here today accepting responsibility, but I want to tell you this now. I love you. Nothing will ever change that, and I want you to find peace, and today is your first step. The Bible says if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just and will forgive us. Chris, I forgive you, and your sister forgives you, and we will never abandon you, and we love you. Dad. Judge, thank you for the opportunity to address the court.
The street is still asleep, and the air has the thin, metallic bite of late summer before sunrise. Porch lights sit like small, tired moons over clipped lawns. driveways hold silent cars that will not move for hours. In the dark, ordinary shapes become suspect: an unattended trash bin, a child's bicycle left on its side, a curtain that does not shift. At the end of one short driveway in a quiet Colorado subdivision, a garage door begins to lift. The sound is not loud, but it is wrong in its timing. It has no business breaking the night at this hour. The door rises in sections, folding upward like a mechanical eyelid, revealing the interior glow of a house that is supposed to be unremarkable, a house that is supposed to contain the predictable debris of family life. Shoes by the entryway, a cup left on a counter, a faint sweetness in the air from shampoo and breakfast cereal. A man steps into the garage with the composed urgency of someone leaving for work. He moves with the efficiency of routine, as if every motion has been practiced for years. But the quiet around him is too complete. There is no soft thump of footsteps behind him, no sleepy voice from a bedroom doorway, no child's complaint carried down a hall. The night does not release its grip. It watches. He backs a vehicle into position, loads items with quick, contained movements, and then, with the precision of someone trying not to wake the house, he closes up and pulls away. In the pale hours that follow, daylight will arrive without ceremony. The world will begin to look normal again. Neighbors will step outside for a moment, let a dog out, pick up a package, wave at nothing in particular. The sky will brighten. The street will fill with the small noises of morning. And still, inside that house, there will be an absence so vast that it will bend the day around it. It will begin, as these things often do, not with a scream, not with a shattering sound, but with the sudden failure of routine. A phone left behind, a door unanswered, a calendar still full of plans that now have no owner, a friend who feels the shape of something wrong and cannot yet name it. By late morning, the house will no longer be a private space. Its air will be disturbed by footsteps, by the soft opening and closing of doors, by people searching the rooms with their eyes and trying to remain calm, trying to insist that ordinary explanations still exist. Shoes sit where they were left. The living room bears the tidy marks of a home that has been maintained with care. A child's room holds the quiet evidence of bedtime rituals, blankets pulled smooth, small objects lined up, the faint scent of laundry and plastic toys. But the people themselves are not there. Not the woman whose presence had, for years, seemed to fill the house with schedules and lists and bright certainty. Not the two little girls whose voices should have turned morning into chaos. The house has been emptied with a thoroughness that cannot be explained by a simple errand. Outside, the sun continues to rise and do what it always does, indifferent to the way human lives fracture. But behind the eyes of the man who drove away before dawn, something has already collapsed into a new shape. He is now living in the moment after a decision, when the mind tries to arrange itself into calmness, tries to behave as if nothing irreversible has been done. In this part of Colorado, the landscape has a blunt, practical beauty. It is a place where the horizon is wide, where suburbs push outward in neat rows, and beyond them lie roads that lead to work sites, storage yards, and oil fields, industrial grids laid over the earth like a second, harsher geometry. Men leave their homes before sunrise and drive out to places where the day is measured in shifts and checklists and safety protocols. The man in the truck belongs to that world. He has the look of someone who can vanish into routine, someone who can stand among others without drawing attention. A quiet demeanor, a controlled voice, the outward posture of reliability. In photographs, he appears as a father who poses with his children, smiles when expected, holds his family close for the camera, the kind of image that people scroll past without pausing. The woman belongs to a different tempo. In the years leading up to that morning, her life had been lived with a kind of public brightness. She documented, organized, planned, and spoke of the future with a conviction that suggests a person who believes that effort can shape destiny. She lived inside the architecture of family, anniversaries, vacations, school schedules, work calls, social circles, and she brought others into it through the modern habit of sharing. She was, to those who watched from the outside, visible. That visibility creates its own illusion of safety. When a life is documented, it seems anchored. It seems less likely to simply disappear. The girls' small, bright, pliable lives fit into that illusion as well. Their existence is recorded in birthday photos, in bedtime snapshots, in the familiar scenes of children being children. They are the kind of children strangers can recognize immediately, faces that could belong to any neighborhood, laughter that could fill any living room. And yet, on this morning, they are gone. In the hours after the realization settles in, the house becomes a stage for worry. A friend's presence is urgent and protective. A neighbor's concern becomes a practical force, someone who checks, someone who looks, someone who offers a camera pointed at the street, the modern witness that never sleeps. The lens shows what human eyes missed. The man's movements in the early dark, the truck, the loading, the departure. Not dramatic, not frantic, only deliberate. Deliberate is a word that changes the temperature of the room when it enters. What follows is a slow tightening. The search for a family at first is framed as a rescue. There is a stubborn human need to believe that missing people are simply delayed, confused, somewhere without a working phone. The mind scrambles for benign explanations, a misunderstanding, a sudden trip, an argument that led to someone leaving to cool off. But the absence of the woman's essentials, the items she would not leave behind, begins to strip those explanations of their plausibility. The phone, the car, the medication, the small, intimate pieces of a person's daily survival. There are also the details that do not announce themselves loudly but sit in the background like stains that will not wash out. The timing, the silence. The man's outward calmness, too smooth to be reassuring, too practiced to be natural under the weight of uncertainty. And then there is the way he presents himself to the world as the worried husband, the concerned father. He stands in front of cameras because, in the modern age, a missing family becomes public almost immediately. He uses the language that is expected of him. He wants them back. He needs them home. He cannot understand where they are. He tries to inhabit the role of the grieving, bewildered man before grief has even been granted the dignity of proof. But the body does not always cooperate with the mask. Tiny fractures show through, an over-controlled expression, a gaze that slips away at certain moments, a tension around the mouth that suggests effort rather than spontaneous emotion. People who watch these scenes later will describe an instinctive discomfort, the sense that something is misaligned, that the performance is not connected to an authentic inner state. In the beginning, even suspicion moves slowly. It does not want to be wrong, it does not want to accuse, it only wants answers that do not exist. The man's name is Chris Watts. The woman's name is Shannon Watts. The children are Bella and Celeste, called CC by those who loved her. Their home sits in Frederick, Colorado, in a neighborhood built for the promise of stability, sidewalks, cul-de-sacs, new construction, the appearance of a future that will unfold according to plan. The kind of place where families move to begin a new chapter, to raise children, to create a life that looks safe from the outside. But safety here is a surface condition. It is paint and lighting and lawn care. It is not a guarantee. Inside the family's life, beneath the shared images and the public optimism, pressures had been accumulating in quieter ways. Money worries that never fully disappear, the strain of balancing work and parenthood. The sharp edges of resentment that can grow when one person feels watched, managed, measured. Marriage is a system that depends on countless small agreements, spoken and unspoken, and when those agreements fracture, the break can be inaudible at first. In the months before that morning, Chris Watts had begun to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately cause alarm. People close to him noticed a change in his appearance, his posture, the way his life seemed to narrow into private preoccupations. He began to take control of his body, his routines, his image. The transformation, on the surface, looked like self-improvement. In another context, it might have been praised as discipline, but discipline can be a doorway to secrecy. It can be a way of constructing a new identity inside the same skin. It can be the first visible symptom of a life splitting into compartments. And then there was another presence, moving in the periphery of his days like a shadow that lengthened over time. A woman connected to his work. A relationship that did not belong in the frame of his family life. A relationship that created a second world, one where he was not a husband, not a father, but a man who could imagine himself unburdened. This is how the story begins to reveal its architecture, not as a sudden eruption, but as a gradual rearrangement of loyalties and fantasies. A man who starts to view his family not as the center of his life, but as an obstacle to the life he wants. A man who begins to experience his own home as confinement rather than belonging. On the weekend before the disappearance, Shannon had been away on a work-related trip. She had traveled with others, maintained her outward momentum, posted and communicated as she always did. There were signs even then of tension, a distance in the way her husband responded. A coolness that did not match the surface language of partnership, the kind of emotional frost that can make a person feel alone even in a marriage. When she returned, late at night, the house should have received her with the familiar sounds of sleep, children tucked in, lights dimmed, the hush of a family ending a day. She arrived in the early hours, exhausted, stepping into the quiet with the assumption that tomorrow would bring its usual demands. But the quiet that night was not the quiet of rest. It was the quiet of a space in which something had already been set in motion. The hours between her arrival and the moment the garage door lifted are the most heavily weighted hours in the story, the hours that will later be reconstructed from fragments, phone data, movements, small digital footprints, the way time stamps a line like cold stars. There is no single sound that marks the crossing point between the life that existed and the life that would be gone. There is only the fact that, after those hours, Shannon and the children will not be seen alive again. What is known, what can be followed with certainty, is what happens after. The missing person narrative unfolds quickly because Shannon's life is interwoven with other lives that pay attention. Friends know her routines, appointments are expected, responses to messages are assumed. When she does not answer, the silence is not interpreted as normal, it is read as alarm. A friend goes to the house. The door is there, solid and ordinary, but it has become a barrier. The absence inside feels immediate. A phone is found, keys, items that do not align with any voluntary departure. Concern hardens into dread. The man returns to face the growing circle of worry, and he steps into the role he knows he must play. He walks through rooms, points out belongings, gestures toward the logic of concern. He tries to steer the narrative toward uncertainty, away from certainty. But certainty is already beginning to form in the minds around him, not as proof yet, but as an instinctive recognition that the shape of this disappearance is wrong. The neighbor's camera footage becomes a hinge point. It does not show violence. It does not show a struggle. It shows only behavior, mundane actions framed by an early morning darkness. And in that mundanity, it implies intent. Chris Watts watches the footage too. The way he stands, the way his body holds tension as he observes himself on a screen becomes its own evidence to those who know what to look for. A person who is innocent of harm tends to watch such footage with fear, with urgency, with a desperate hope that something outside the frame will explain what is missing. A person who knows what happened watches for a different reason, to measure how much has been seen. The net begins to draw in quietly. Phones are checked. Records are pulled. The lines of his story are compared against the hard, indifferent data of time and location. The calm neighborhood starts to feel like an enclosure. The sky remains bright, the lawns remain trimmed, but the air around the house grows thick with the knowledge that the worst possibilities are no longer unthinkable. And somewhere beyond the suburb, out where the earth is punctured by metal and the landscape is marked with tanks and rigs, there are places few people go unless they have a reason. Places that are functional rather than human. Places where sound is swallowed by distance, where the smell of oil and machinery clings to the air, where the ground itself seems indifferent to what is brought there. Chris Watts had a reason to go there every day, and on the morning his family vanished, he went there early. The truck moved through dawn toward the work site with its familiar route, and the sky above it began to lighten, and the world, unaware of what had been loaded into the quiet hours, started another ordinary day. The day advances with the slow inevitability of sunlight, and with it, the story begins to tighten around the places where truth cannot hide for long. In a case like this, the first hours are defined by a strange contradiction. Everything is urgent, and yet almost nothing is certain. People move quickly, speak quickly, search quickly, but the answers are not waiting where they should be. A missing family is an absence that pulls everyone toward it, and still it remains empty. Inside the Watts home, the air takes on a different weight. The house is no longer simply a place where a family lived, it becomes a container for questions. Every object seems to sit in silent testimony to routine, a cup, a blanket, a child's toy. None of it is dramatic. That is what makes it unbearable. The normality feels staged, as if the home itself has been instructed to keep pretending, even as the people have vanished from it. The man stays near the center of the scene because he has no choice. His presence is expected, demanded. He is the husband, the father, the person who should be most frantic. But he is also the only person who seems to know, in the deepest private part of his mind, that the search is not a rescue mission. He has already stepped past the boundary that separates fear from aftermath, and in that boundary, everything changes. What follows in the early phase is not a single leap to conclusion, but a series of small collisions between his narrative and the physical world. He offers a story of uncertainty. The world answers with details. He tries to keep his voice steady. The details keep arriving anyway, each one refusing to cooperate with the version of events he needs. The first hard thing that presses against him is the simple fact of Shannon's life. She was not a person who disappeared quietly. She left digital traces, schedules, obligations. She did not drift. She planned. She announced. She coordinated. Her sudden silence is not merely unusual, it is incompatible with who she was. A woman like that does not vanish without leaving a ripple. The second hard thing is the speed at which concern becomes organized. A friend does what friends do when instinct rises into certainty. She acts. She does not wait for explanations to arrive. She does not soothe herself with optimism. That kind of friend becomes, without intending it, the most dangerous type of witness, the witness who appears too early for a lie to settle comfortably into place. The third hard thing is the neighborhood itself. Suburbs are built on proximity. Houses stand close, windows face each other, driveways align. People may not know each other's souls, but they know patterns, who leaves when, who comes back late, who never misses trash day, whose garage door is always closed. The suburban world watches without thinking of itself as watching, so when the neighbor brings forward the footage, it feels less like surveillance and more like the neighborhood's collective memory made visible. The truck. The early hour, the loading, the departure. It is all ordinary, and yet it is the first time the ordinary begins to look like a kind of premeditation. From there, the space between suspicion and accusation narrows quickly, not because of a single revelation, but because Chris Watts does not behave like a man whose family has simply wandered off. His composure is too tidy, his language is too controlled. His concern feels like a gesture rather than an instinct. There are moments, small, almost microscopic moments, where the mask slips. A glance away at the wrong time, a swallowed breath, a hand motion that reveals agitation. These are not definitive on their own, but they add up in the mind like sediment, building a layer of doubt that becomes difficult to remove. As daylight fades into evening, the absence remains absolute. Shannon's car is still there. The children's belongings are still there. The home sits with its doors and windows as if nothing has happened, and this is what begins to feel impossible, that an entire family could evaporate from a life that is otherwise intact. The search widens, but it widens into emptiness. Beyond the neighborhood, Chris's work life begins to loom larger. The oil field sites he visits are not romantic landscapes. They are utilitarian, ruled by schedules and safety standards and the hum of machinery. They are places where people focus on tasks, where the mind narrows into procedure. In such places, a man can move through space with a sense of authority simply because he belongs there. That morning, he had used that belonging. The location data begins to form a silent outline. It does not speak in words, it speaks in points, times, movements, the kind of information that does not care about intention. It records what happened without interpretation. It shows where his phone traveled. It shows the early arrival at a site he had reason to visit. It begins to suggest that his workday was not quite like other workdays. And then there is the emotional problem at the heart of it, a problem that drives many crimes of this kind, the existence of a private life running alongside the public one. A relationship, hidden at first, becomes visible through the kind of modern residue that secrecy cannot fully erase: calls, messages, patterns of contact. The shape of Chris Watts's attention begins to appear elsewhere, outside his home. In the days before the disappearance, his energy had been invested not in repairing the fraying fabric of his marriage, but in stepping toward another world entirely. A world where he could imagine himself unencumbered. A world where he could be seen as new. Affairs do not automatically lead to murder. Most end in collapse, in heartbreak, in separation, in chaos. But in certain minds, under certain pressures, the affair becomes not just an escape, but a blueprint. It offers a vision of a future that requires the removal of the present. This is where the story begins to reveal its deepest, most unsettling tension, the gap between the man people thought they knew and the man who could envision his family as something to be erased. In the days that follow, the pressure on Chris becomes constant. It is not simply external pressure. It is the pressure of holding a false reality together. It requires continuous maintenance. It requires attention to detail. It requires the ability to predict what others will ask, what they will notice, what information will surface next. And the modern world is not kind to those who need secrecy. There are cameras, there are phone records, there are digital trails, there are the quiet, relentless memories of devices. He gives interviews. He makes appeals. He performs the role of desperate husband. But each performance carries risk because the more he speaks, the more space there is for contradiction. The more he tries to insist on innocence, the more his language is examined for cracks. At some point, he begins to look like a man caught between worlds, still physically present in the life he is supposed to be living, but mentally already in the life he wants. That split is visible in the way he carries himself. His eyes sometimes seem vacant, as if he is looking through people rather than at them. His body language is tight, contained. He appears like someone trying to hold his own skin together. The investigation, even without being directly shown, can be felt in the way the atmosphere thickens. There is a tightening circle around him, a narrowing of possibilities. His statements are weighed. His movements are mapped. His version of events is held up against what can be verified. And then comes the moment where a lie begins to collapse, not because of a grand, dramatic revelation, but because the liar is exhausted by the effort of maintaining it. The first significant shift comes when he offers an explanation that attempts to place blame elsewhere, not on himself, but on the woman who is missing. It is a strategy as old as fear. He tries to introduce a story in which Shannon is the agent of disappearance, the one who left, the one who did something unthinkable, the one who forced his hand into reaction. It is a story that, in another era, might have lived longer, might have found space to grow in the fog of uncertainty. But this era is different. This era has data. This era has timelines that can be reconstructed down to minutes. It has the unblinking eye of cameras. It has the residue of communication. It has the ability to compare what a man says with where his phone was, what his truck did, what he searched, what he avoided. And when those comparisons begin to tighten, the story he offers starts to feel not only implausible, but desperate. The desperation itself becomes another form of evidence. The investigation does not require shouting to be devastating. It only requires patience. It allows the suspect to keep talking, to keep moving, to keep revealing inconsistencies. It allows him to believe, briefly, that he is managing the situation even as the walls close in. There is a moment, later described in stark procedural terms, when Chris Watts sits in a setting that is designed to remove comfort. The lighting is flat. The air is controlled. There is no softness in the environment. It is a place where the human mind is meant to confront itself. He tries to keep control. He tries to keep the narrative organized. He tries to continue the performance, but control is not infinite. When a person has done something irreversible and has then spent days pretending it did not happen, a psychological fatigue begins to erode the structure. The lie becomes heavy. The body begins to betray what the mouth tries to conceal. Tears appear and vanish in strange rhythms. Words come out too quickly or too slowly. Anger surfaces where grief should be. Silence arrives where explanation is needed. And somewhere inside him, the compartment that holds what truly happened begins to crack. It is not a cinematic shattering. It is more like a slow fracture in ice. At first it is invisible, then it spreads. Then the entire surface gives way. When he finally begins to admit pieces of the truth, it comes in layers, as if even now he is trying to shape the story into something that preserves a fragment of his self-image. He offers a version in which he is reacting, not initiating. A version in which he is forced, not choosing. A version in which he is still, somehow, less monstrous than the reality demands. But even in its partial form, the admission is a turning point. The public narrative shifts from rescue to recovery. The search no longer holds hope in the same way. It becomes a hunt for bodies. The question changes from where are they to what did he do with them? And that question, once asked, points outward, beyond the house, beyond the neighborhood, toward the places he went before dawn, toward the oil fields, toward the industrial landscape where the earth is opened and sealed without sentiment. It is there, in that harsh geometry of work sites and tanks, that the story becomes almost unbearable in its cold logistics. Because what was done was not only violent, it was methodical. And as the recovery begins to take shape, the details emerge not with theatrical flourish, but with a kind of blunt cruelty. the world learns, piece by piece, how far a person can go when they have decided that other lives are obstacles, not sacred presences. The tanks stand out there like silent monuments to industry, their surfaces dull under the open sky. They were never built for human stories. They were built for function, for containment, for storage. And yet they become, in this case, part of the final geography of disappearance, a place where human lives are treated like waste to be hidden. The landscape does not change in response. The sky remains wide. The wind still moves. The earth still holds whatever is placed into it, but the meaning of that place, once purely industrial, has been permanently altered by what occurred there. And as the days progress toward recovery, toward evidence, toward the slow march of legal consequence, the man who once appeared ordinary begins to look less like a person and more like a void that wore a human face, a void into which an entire family was made to vanish. The house in Frederick remains standing, intact, quiet, with its windows reflecting the same sunlight they always have, while the true damage radiates outward into everything and everyone who must now live in the aftermath, in the knowledge that the worst thing was not a stranger in the dark, but a familiar figure moving through routine, lifting a garage door before dawn and driving away as if the day were normal. And the worst part, the part that lingers like a bruise in the mind, is that for a few hours after he left, the world still believed it was. The world has a way of continuing even when the center has been cut out of it. Cars pass through intersections, coffee is poured, emails are answered, the sun slides across windows and floors as if nothing has changed. But inside the narrow circle forming around that house, time begins to behave differently. It slows and sharpens. It becomes a series of fixed points, moments that will later be replayed, measured, argued over, remembered with a precision usually reserved for disasters. In the earliest phase, there is still a public insistence on possibility. Missing does not automatically mean dead. People cling to that because the alternative is too complete, too final. The mind will accept uncertainty before it will accept extinction. But the logic of the situation is already hardening. The woman's absence is not a clean break from her life. It is a rupture. The children's absence is not a spontaneous adventure. It is a silence where there should have been noise. The home is full of evidence that morning began and then failed to finish. The man remains in the center of the widening attention, and the attention itself becomes a kind of pressure that he cannot control. He is watched not only by those closest to the case, but by strangers who have never met him, who look at him through the lens of the missing family narrative and search for the familiar patterns of grief. People expect him to be falling apart. They expect a rawness that breaks through any attempt at composure. Instead, they see containment. They see a man who seems to be regulating his face, regulating his words, regulating his body as though emotion is something that must be managed rather than lived. The problem with management is that it draws focus. It invites analysis. In those first days, he tries to remain inside the frame of normalcy. He goes through the motions. He speaks of return. He gestures toward hope as if hope can be manufactured. But each time he does, the gap between his performance and the gravity of the situation becomes more pronounced. the world begins to look for an explanation, and explanations are rarely found in a vacuum. They appear in patterns where money goes, where attention goes, where secrecy grows. The shape of Chris Watts's private life becomes clearer with each passing hour. It is not revealed by a single dramatic discovery. It is revealed by routine evidence, contacts, communication, the rhythm of phone calls that suggests dependency and intimacy. It begins to show that while his family life was collapsing, another connection was becoming central. In a disappearance case, that kind of revelation does not exist in isolation. It folds into everything else. It creates a motive-shaped space in the narrative. It suggests a reason for a man to want a different future, but motive alone is not proof. Motive is simply a doorway. To walk through it, the story needs physical reality. Physical reality begins to accumulate in small, cold increments, times, locations, deviations from normal procedure. A work site visited early. A phone moving where it said it moved. A truck where it should not have been at that hour. Data does not accuse, but it does not forget. It insists on its own chronology. The chronology begins to hem him in. He is asked to account for his movements, and he does, but his account must now compete with the silent certainty of records. It is one thing to speak a story into existence when no one can verify it. It is another to speak when the world already knows where your body was, where your vehicle was, what your phone touched, what your day looked like minute by minute. Under that kind of scrutiny, lies become smaller. They begin to change shape. They become more specific, more defensive. The liar stops offering broad, open explanations and begins to offer narrow ones, designed to fit the spaces where evidence has not yet arrived. That narrowing is its own form of panic. There comes a point when the suspicion is no longer an atmosphere but a direct force. The setting shifts. He is no longer just the husband at a house with worried friends and neighbors. He is placed in a controlled environment, surrounded by the kind of calm that is meant to unsettle. The room is ordinary in a harsh way, flat walls, institutional lighting, chairs designed for function rather than comfort. It is a place that makes the human body look exposed. In such a room, a person's inner world becomes visible in the smallest motions. The way the hands move, the way the eyes track, the way a foot taps, then stops, then taps again, the way breath changes when a certain subject is touched. He continues to try to appear coherent, reasonable, concerned. He tries to speak as if he is still standing on firm ground, but the ground has been eroding beneath him since the moment he drove away before dawn. The first confession does not arrive as a clean, whole truth. It arrives like a compromise between reality and the story he wants to believe about himself. He offers a version of events that shifts the weight away from him, even as it admits that something catastrophic occurred. It is a strategy that reveals a certain kind of psychological mechanics. If he can present himself as a man pushed beyond endurance, a man reacting rather than initiating, he can attempt to preserve a final shred of distinction between what happened and what it means about him. But the truth does not cooperate with narrative. The truth is indifferent to framing. As he speaks, the details begin to surface, partial, then fuller, then heavier. The missing family becomes, in his words, something else entirely, not missing but concealed. not absent but placed somewhere. The act of disappearance is converted into geography. It becomes a question of where. And where, inevitably, leads back to the places he knows best, the places he can enter without scrutiny, the work sites, the industrial terrain where access is ordinary and questions are rare. A search shifts direction with a grim efficiency. The focus is no longer on neighborhoods, shopping centers, roads where a car might have been seen. It is on the quiet locations that exist outside everyday visibility. Open land. Work areas, sites built for machinery and storage, not for human stories. The first discoveries are not delivered with drama, they arrive with a kind of procedural finality. The landscape is examined, the earth is disturbed. The air becomes filled with the noise of activity that does not sound like rescue. It sounds like retrieval. The work site is stark in daylight. There is no softness there, no domestic context. It is an environment where even a person's footsteps seem out of place. Metal structures stand against the sky. The ground is functional, bare. Everything is designed to hold something: equipment, fuel, material. And then, in the midst of that industrial logic, the most human reality appears, the evidence that the missing people did not simply vanish, that they were taken from the world with intent. The recoveries unfold in stages, each one stripping away whatever remained of the initial hope. The details are not sensationalized by the environment. The environment remains indifferent. That indifference is what makes it unbearable. The tanks do not change, the wind does not stop, the sky does not darken in response. The world behaves as if these are merely objects being removed from a place they should not be, but they are not objects. They are the evidence of lives that had routines, habits, small preferences, and the soft, repetitive patterns of family existence. The knowledge of what was done to conceal them sits in the mind like something toxic, because it reveals not only violence but calculation. It suggests time spent deciding, time spent choosing methods. Time spent acting while the world still believed in normality. When the bodies are found, the public narrative changes completely. The story becomes fixed in a new way, no longer elastic with possibility. The language shifts from missing to murdered, from search to investigation, from hope to consequence. The man's image shifts as well. Whatever remained of the ordinary father, the quiet husband, begins to fall away. He is no longer interpreted through the lens of grief. He is interpreted through the lens of removal, how a person can mentally separate himself from those closest to him, how a person can decide that the elimination of a family is the price of a new life. The legal system begins its slow work, which is less dramatic than people imagine and more relentless than they expect. It moves through paperwork, hearings, procedures that are designed not to satisfy emotion but to establish record. In the courtroom, the weight is not carried by speeches. It is carried by silence, by the presence of photographs that do not need commentary, by the visible strain on faces in the room, by the way the air seems to thicken when certain facts are acknowledged. The man appears in that environment as something diminished. The confident posture of a person who believes he can control perception is gone. What remains is a body occupying space under the gaze of others, a body that must now endure the scrutiny he tried to escape. He pleads. He accepts terms. The machinery of consequence closes around him with an impersonal firmness. The future he imagined, unburdened, new, free, collapses into a different kind of future entirely, one ruled by confinement and repetition and the permanent presence of what he did. Outside the legal room, the lives around the case begin to fracture in quieter ways. Family members are pulled into public visibility they did not choose. Their faces become associated with a story that strangers discuss over meals, in comment sections, in conversations that treat the most intimate devastation as content. The house remains. It sits on its street like a prop left behind after filming has ended. The rooms still hold the layout of family life, but the life itself is gone. In the mind, the place becomes haunted not by the supernatural, but by the knowledge of what occurred without noise. A bedroom where children once slept, a staircase where footsteps once ran, a kitchen where plans were once made. And still, the mind keeps returning to the simplest image because it contains the entire catastrophe in miniature. A garage door lifting before dawn, a man moving through routine, loading a vehicle with the calm of someone who is not panicking, because panic belongs to those who do not know what has already been decided. The story, when viewed from a distance, seems to contain an impossible contradiction. How could a person live alongside others, share meals, share photographs, share a bed, and then treat those lives as removable? But up close, the contradiction becomes less impossible and more chillingly human. The human mind can compartmentalize. It can justify. It can shrink empathy until it is nearly silent. It can interpret obligation as imprisonment. It can replace the complex reality of other people with a simplified narrative in which they are obstacles rather than beings. In the months that follow, more details emerge not because the story needs embellishment, but because human systems demand completeness. Timelines are refined. Communication records are examined. The shape of the affair, the fantasy life, the internal shift in his priorities becomes clearer. There is an almost clinical process of turning a family into evidence, turning a marriage into a case file, turning children into names on documents. The public consumes these details with an intensity that speaks to a collective fear. The fear that the most dangerous thing is not always what waits in the dark outside the home, but what can sit at a kitchen table and be mistaken for ordinary. And yet, beneath the public fascination, the case remains what it always was at its core, a private catastrophe made visible. A mother whose life was moving forward with plans and future. Two children whose world was still small and safe, whose trust was built into the structure of their days. A husband who, at some point, began to move through his own life as though it were something he could edit, revise, erase. The aftermath stretches outward in circles that do not end neatly. There are those who must live with the permanence of the loss. There is the hollow echo of birthdays that will not be celebrated. There is the absence that settles into holidays, into ordinary mornings, into the kind of quiet that is no longer peaceful because it has been altered by what it contains. And somewhere, far from the suburban street and its tidy lights, the industrial landscape remains what it always was: tanks and metal and open sky. While carrying, invisibly, the stain of having been used as a place where a man tried to turn human beings into something that could be hidden. As if disappearance could be engineered like any other task, as if a family could be removed from the world the way a vehicle pulls away from a driveway, leaving nothing behind but a darkened house and the slow arrival of day. After the first terrible geography is established, the story does not stop. It only changes texture. The early phase is loud with urgency and discovery, but what comes after is quieter and in some ways harder to endure. The days that follow are not filled with the adrenaline of searching. They are filled with paperwork, procedures, repeated viewing of the same facts until they lose their shock and become a kind of permanent ache. The house in Frederick becomes less a home than a landmark. People who never knew the family begin to know the address. They know the street name. They know the layout from photographs and videos. They can picture the staircase, the entryway, the garage. The private space of ordinary life becomes public property in the form of images that circulate endlessly, stripped of context, flattened into symbols. Inside that circulation, the human reality becomes both omnipresent and strangely distant. Names are repeated so often they begin to sound like categories rather than people. Faces become familiar to strangers who have never stood in the same room with them. The family's daily life, once documented as a way of sharing joy, progress, routine, becomes a kind of archive that is searched for warning signs, for hints of fracture, for evidence that something was always there and simply unnoticed. The mind is drawn to that search because it wants prediction. It wants to believe that horror announces itself, that it leaves clues that can be recognized in time. It wants to believe there is a reliable distinction between safe and unsafe, between normal and dangerous. So people go back through old footage and still photographs, looking for a shadow on the wall, a tightened smile, a moment of distance, anything that can be labeled as the beginning. But beginnings are rarely dramatic. They are often indistinguishable from ordinary strain. The family's life, like most lives, contains the familiar pressures that accumulate without being understood as catastrophic, financial stress that tightens options, the strain of raising young children, of sleep disruptions, of constant planning. A marriage that becomes less romantic and more logistical, governed by schedules and obligations. Moments of control and resistance, of pride and resentment, the common abrasions of two people trying to share a life and failing to align their private inner worlds. In that field of ordinary stress, the affair becomes a kind of accelerant. It offers contrast. It offers a version of the self that feels lighter, more admired, more free. It offers the intoxication of being seen without the history of compromise. And once the contrast exists, returning to the ordinary life can begin to feel unbearable to someone who has allowed fantasy to become a substitute for responsibility. The story that forms around Chris Watts in the aftermath is not built only from what he did, but from the starkness of what he seemed to want, an erased past, a clean new beginning, an existence without obligations that had once been central. The chilling quality is not simply the violence. It is the way the violence appears to have been used as a tool of life editing, as if human lives could be removed the way one removes objects from a room. What comes next, in the official sense, is a process of narrowing. Once the recoveries occur, the case ceases to be a question and becomes a structure. Evidence is gathered and organized. Timelines are formalized. Documents are created that turn human existence into entries, exhibits, and sequences. The language becomes precise and impersonal because systems require precision, and precision has no room for the soft mess of grief. In the legal space, the atmosphere is heavy without needing theatricality. A courtroom does not have to be loud to be punishing. It can punish with stillness. It can punish with the slow movement of procedure. A person sits or stands in a place where he cannot control the frame anymore, where the room belongs to the record, where the world's attention is directed not by him but at him. There is a moment in such cases when the story becomes irrevocably fixed. It happens not with a dramatic flourish but with a formal acceptance, an admission that eliminates the possibility of alternative narratives. Once that admission is entered, the future closes into a narrower corridor. The man who once moved through routine now moves through containment. The details of confinement are not cinematic, they are repetitive. Concrete walls, regulated hours, fluorescent light, the constant absence of privacy. A life becomes smaller, reduced to schedules that are not his. In that reduction, a different kind of time begins, time that does not progress toward new possibilities but cycles through the same limited days. Outside, the aftermath expands in the opposite direction. It touches people who never met the family. It draws communities into argument, speculation, fixation. The case becomes a reference point, a shorthand for the fear that intimacy does not always protect, that the most devastating harm can occur inside the most ordinary structures. The victim's relatives are pulled into a visibility that offers no relief. Their grief is not allowed to remain private. It is consumed, discussed, measured. Every expression is interpreted. Every decision is judged by strangers who are hungry for coherence, for moral simplicity, for an explanation that will make the world feel predictable again. And predictability remains out of reach. The house itself becomes part of the story's lingering pathology. It is a physical object that cannot participate in grief but cannot escape association. Its walls remain upright, its rooms intact, its fixtures unchanged. It contains nothing supernatural, and yet it carries an atmosphere that people describe as if something has soaked into the structure. Not a haunting in the old sense, but a persistent awareness that what happened did not require a remote wilderness or an unfamiliar alley. It happened within walls that were designed for safety, with children's belongings still in place, with the outward appearance of life continuing right up until it stopped. Over time, the case takes on the characteristic that modern cases often acquire. It multiplies into versions of itself. There is the official version, locked in documents and outcomes. There is the public version, shaped by what is repeated and circulated. There are the private versions held by those who knew the family, versions built from memories of real voices and real habits and the physical presence of people who are now absent. And there is the internal version that remains trapped inside the man who caused the disappearance, a version that, even when outwardly acknowledged, never fully satisfies the world's need to understand. A human being can admit to actions without admitting to the full depth of the internal movement that made those actions possible. The mind can still protect itself, even in confession, by withholding the most revealing truths, not what was done, but how it was experienced from the inside. This is one of the reasons the story does not settle. The facts of the outcome can be established, but the inner mechanism remains partially concealed, partly because it is private, partly because it may not be coherent even to the person who lived it. Some motives are not a single motive. They are a convergence of pressures, desires, resentments, fantasies, and an erosion of empathy so gradual that it is invisible until it is complete. When people study the case, they often focus on the obvious narrative hooks, the suburban setting, the recorded footage, the affair, the rapid collapse. But beneath those hooks is a more uncomfortable reality, one that does not offer dramatic warning signs. It is the reality of a person who learns to present an acceptable face to the world while developing a private internal life that is increasingly detached from the lives around him. Detachment is not always visible in the way a person talks. Sometimes it appears in the way a person fails to imagine consequences as real, in the way he treats other people's futures as negotiable, in the way he experiences obligation as something external, a weight imposed rather than a bond freely maintained. And when detachment reaches a certain depth, the boundary that most people cannot cross, the boundary between wanting a different life and taking a life to get it, can begin to look to that person like a logistical problem rather than a moral impossibility. The case continues to live in the cultural imagination because it sits directly on a fault line in modern life, the way families are both private and public, the way relationships are documented, the way the exterior of a life can look stable even when the interior is under strain. It forces a confrontation with the fact that visibility does not equal knowledge, that an audience does not equal intimacy, that a smiling image does not equal safety. In the quieter aftermath, the most haunting element is not a single violent act, but the ordinary time that existed before it, the breakfasts, the bedtime routines, the small arguments, the planning for the future. The fact that those routines existed right up until they did not, and that one person within that routine was already moving mentally toward an outcome the others could not imagine. It leaves behind a question that does not resolve cleanly because it cannot, how a person lives for years inside a family structure, absorbing its rituals, benefiting from its stability, and then, at the crucial moment, treats it as removable. The question does not fade with sentencing, with time, with the closing of legal files. It lingers because it is not purely about one case. It is about the fragile trust that holds ordinary life together, the assumption that the people we share space with are bound by the same internal laws we believe govern ourselves. And in the quiet of a typical morning, when a garage door lifts in some other neighborhood, when a vehicle pulls away before dawn, there is now, for those who know this story, a brief, involuntary flicker of unease, a sense that routine can sometimes be a disguise. That the most significant rupture can happen without noise, and that the first sign of catastrophe can be nothing more than an empty house that should not be empty, and a day that begins as if it has permission to go on, while somewhere in the mind of one ordinary man it already has. And yet, even that flicker of unease does not fully explain the way the ordinary can be turned inside out. It only acknowledges that the transformation is possible, that routine can be used the way a curtain is used, and that the most catastrophic decisions can be made in rooms that still smell faintly of detergent and children's lotion. When the story is pulled apart and examined in the months and years that follow, it becomes clear that the disappearance did not erupt out of nothing. It rose out of a slow internal drift, a shift in the balance between obligation and desire, between the shared life and the private one. The outward structure of the family remained visible, but the interior alignment began to change. There were practical pressures that never entirely leave a household once they take root. Money that does not stretch as far as it should. Bills that arrive with the steady rhythm of threat. The quiet humiliation of needing to present stability while feeling the floor tremble beneath it. A marriage under that kind of pressure can either tighten into solidarity or thin into resentment, and sometimes the difference between those outcomes is not visible until it is already too late. There was also the physical reality of their stage of life. 2 small children, the constant need for attention. The exhaustion that accumulates in the body like sediment. The way romance can be replaced by logistics without either partner consciously choosing it. The way a home can feel to one person like a project that must be managed, and to the other like a space in which he is always being evaluated. Shannon's outward energy was the kind that builds momentum. Her days were full. Her planning was persistent. She moved through life as if it could be organized into workable pieces, as if a determined person could keep disorder at bay by staying ahead of it. She was not invisible, and she did not live quietly. Chris, by contrast, had the kind of presence that recedes. He could occupy a space without dominating it. He could appear compliant, agreeable, low friction. That kind of demeanor can be interpreted as stability, but it can also function as concealment. A person who rarely asserts himself openly can still carry a private world of thoughts that never surface, thoughts that remain unchallenged because they remain unspoken. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, those 2 styles of existence began to grind against each other more sharply. There were signs of emotional withdrawal, a sense of distance where closeness had once been assumed. The marriage began to feel less like a shared project and more like 2 parallel tracks, still running alongside each other but no longer connected in the way they had been. Then the affair became not merely an event but a rupture in the internal hierarchy of his life. A relationship formed in the orbit of his work, and it offered him a new version of himself, unburdened by the history of his marriage, unshadowed by responsibilities that had begun to feel heavy. In that other space, he could be desirable rather than required. He could be spontaneous rather than scheduled. He could imagine a future that did not involve the daily friction of parenthood and financial strain and domestic negotiation. That is how an affair can become more than a secret. It can become a lens through which the original life is reinterpreted. The family that once felt like a purpose begins to feel like an impediment. The marriage that once provided identity begins to feel like an enclosure. The children who once defined the shape of the days become, in the mind of a person drifting far enough from empathy, part of the weight. For most people, even that drift does not lead to eradication. It leads to separation, to upheaval, to conflict, to loss. But in some minds, under particular combinations of pressure and fantasy, the desire for a new life becomes fused with the idea that the old life must be removed completely. Not ended in the sense of divorce or departure, but erased. The days surrounding the disappearance reveal how much of modern life is recorded, and how little of that recording feels like protection until after the fact. A person's phone becomes a ledger of movement and communication. A vehicle becomes a trackable object. Cameras capture the edges of the story without understanding what they are seeing. Even a simple device that counts steps can provide a cold reconstruction of a night that would otherwise remain hidden behind closed doors. The night Shannon returned, she came back into a house that still held all the outward signals of domestic continuity. The children were meant to be sleeping upstairs. The lights were meant to be low. The air was meant to be the ordinary air of a family home at the end of a day. She had been away and expected, as people often do, that the argument and tension could be addressed later, that fatigue could be slept off, that the future would still be available in the morning. But the hours after her arrival would later be treated less like private time and more like a sealed corridor, reconstructed with relentless attention to sequence. When the world cannot accept what happened, it tries to locate the exact minute when it became inevitable. It searches for the moment where the line was crossed, as if finding it would restore meaning. In reality, the crossing is rarely a single moment. It is an accumulation that reaches a threshold. By the time the neighborhood woke, the threshold had already been reached. The garage door had lifted, the vehicle had moved, the street had watched without comprehension, and the house had begun its strange new role as a container for absence. As the story progressed into its official phase, the shift from uncertainty to confession did not bring clarity so much as it brought a deeper, heavier form of knowledge. The early lies had at least allowed the mind to hover over possibility. The admission that his family was not coming back forced the world into a more rigid reality. Even then, the truth came in gradations. What was initially offered was shaped to minimize, to redirect, to preserve some internal narrative of reaction rather than initiation. The mind that commits such acts often tries, even afterward, to manage perception, if not of others, then of itself. It is not always a conscious strategy. Sometimes it is simply the last remaining instinct of self-preservation. But the physical facts of the case were too severe to remain contained inside a partial narrative. Once the geography of the work site became part of the record, the story could no longer live entirely in language. It was anchored in places and procedures and objects. The oil tanks, the open land, the industrial quiet of the site, these were not symbols chosen for drama. They were functional realities used in an attempt to conceal. That attempt, in turn, revealed something essential about the mindset involved, a reliance on routine and access, on the expectation that the work environment would absorb whatever was brought into it without question. A belief that the industrial landscape could be used as cover because it is already impersonal, already ruled by systems that do not look for human meaning. After the recovery, the case entered the slow, formal corridor of legal consequence. What the public often imagines as a single climactic moment is in reality a succession of administrative steps, documents filed, dates assigned, procedures followed. The weight carried not by grand speeches but by the quiet presentation of facts that do not soften when repeated. In those spaces, the atmosphere is not cinematic, but it is dense. The room holds a tension that is both emotional and procedural because grief has to coexist with process. People sit with their faces arranged into endurance because endurance is the only posture available when the event itself cannot be undone. Chris Watts, within that structure, becomes less a person performing for cameras and more a person contained by record. His body is present, but his autonomy is reduced. The system does not care how persuasive he is. It cares what can be established. It cares what is acknowledged. It cares what is entered into permanence. And yet, even permanence does not resolve the story in the way people want it to. It resolves the outcome. It resolves the official narrative. It does not resolve the internal mechanism that made the outcome possible. That mechanism remains the most disturbing part precisely because it cannot be neatly categorized. It is not an external force that arrived from nowhere. It is a human drift, a reorientation, a quiet internal reshaping that occurred while the outside still looked intact. In the long aftermath, the case continues to be revisited because it sits too close to ordinary life. It forces the uncomfortable recognition that danger is not always visible as chaos. Sometimes it is visible only in retrospect, in the small deviations that seemed, at the time, like nothing more than mood or stress or distance. A marriage under pressure, a person withdrawing, a private life expanding behind a familiar face, a future imagined so intensely that the present begins to feel disposable. And when that disposability reaches a certain depth, the house itself becomes less a home than a stage for disappearance, a place where objects remain in place while lives are removed, where the most telling evidence is not what is broken, but what is untouched. A child's bed still made, a staircase still clean, a kitchen counter still holding the remnants of yesterday's routine. The mind returns to those untouched details because they represent the final betrayal of normality. They show how little the environment resisted, how quietly everything happened. How the world outside the front door remained calm while, inside the private space of that family, the future was being dismantled. And in that calm, in the clean lines of suburban architecture and the wide indifference of the Colorado sky, the story continues to sit, heavy, unresolved in the way that matters most. Not because the outcome is unknown, but because the human capacity it reveals does not belong only to one man or one street or one house. It belongs to the darker possibility inside routine itself, the possibility that someone can move through familiar rooms, through familiar roles, through the rituals of family life, while privately preparing to make that life disappear as if it had never been there at all. As if it had never been there at all. The mind resists that notion because it knows, at a cellular level, that family life is not a file that can be deleted. It is not a set of images that can be removed from a feed. It is weight and warmth and sound. It is the repetition of names spoken 1,000 times in kitchens and hallways. It is the steady, often unseen labor of keeping small lives safe. To treat that as removable is to reveal a kind of internal emptiness that most people do not want to believe exists, because believing it changes how the world feels. And yet the record of the months before the disappearance shows a life that had begun to separate into compartments, each one sealed from the others as tightly as possible. There is the visible compartment, the house, the neighborhood, the appearance of domestic continuity. There is the compartment of obligation, bills, work hours, parenting. And there is the private compartment where fantasy grows, where the idea of a different future becomes vivid enough to start pulling at the edges of the present. In the heat of that summer, there had been distance in a literal sense. Travel, time spent away, children taken to see family, the house in Colorado standing with fewer voices inside it. A home can feel different when it is emptied of its usual sound. Rooms that were once crowded with routine become hollow. That hollowness can be peaceful for a moment, and then, for certain minds, it becomes addictive. It becomes a taste of a life without friction, without negotiation, without the constant demand to be a husband and a father. When a person begins to crave that emptiness, he starts to interpret the return of family not as reunion, but as invasion. During those weeks, the rhythm of contact changes. Messages become shorter, responses slow. The emotional tone thins. The warmth that once padded the edges of communication begins to disappear, replaced by something cooler, something that reads like obligation rather than desire. In a marriage that is already under strain, those shifts land like small blows. They do not break everything at once, but they bruise, and bruises accumulate. Shannon's life, even away from home, remained structured around connection. She reached out. She tried to hold the relationship together through attention, through questions, through the insistence that problems can be confronted and solved. That insistence can look from the outside like control, but it can also be read as fear, the fear that if the fabric loosens even slightly, the whole thing will tear. And in the background of that strain was something both intimate and enormous. She was carrying a third child. Pregnancy does not merely add a future to a household. It changes the emotional physics of the present. It intensifies everything. It makes plans heavier, makes uncertainty feel dangerous. It is the body holding a promise that cannot defend itself. For a woman who is already trying to stabilize a marriage, it can turn anxiety into a constant hum beneath every conversation. For a man who has begun to imagine escape, it can feel like a tightening knot. There is a particular cruelty in the timing, the way new life can be growing while a person's internal loyalties are dying. The body moves forward, building, preparing. The mind elsewhere pulls away, dismantling. It is in that context that the affair takes on its full power, not simply as betrayal, but as an alternate reality that begins to compete with the existing one. In the alternate reality, there is no mortgage stress in the same way, no children waking at night, no schedules that require constant coordination. There is attention, novelty, admiration. The illusion of being understood without effort. A person who is unskilled at confronting discomfort can mistake that illusion for truth. As the summer progressed, the gap between the compartments widened. Chris Watts did not appear to move toward repair. He moved toward detachment. The detachment showed itself not in dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet refusal to engage. A kind of emotional absence that can be more destabilizing than anger, because it offers nothing to push against, nothing to negotiate with. It is like trying to hold a conversation with a closed door. When Shannon returned to Colorado from being away, the physical reunion could not bridge the psychological distance that had formed. There are moments in relationships when the body is present, but the mind has already left. Those moments carry a subtle horror because they mimic intimacy while withholding it. In the days immediately before the disappearance, that mimicry became brittle. The household was full again, but the sense of connection did not return with the suitcases. The air between them was charged with a tension that could not be dissolved by sleep. The children's needs still existed, still demanded attention, but the adult relationship beneath it was no longer stable enough to hold the weight. The weekend unfolded with the kind of uneasy normalcy that people later recognize as the calm before something breaks. Plans existed. Appointments were on the calendar. Messages were exchanged. The surface continued because the surface always tries to continue. That is what makes the eventual rupture so disorienting. The brain insists that if a day begins like a normal day, it should end like one. The night Shannon came home from her trip, she returned not only to a house, but to a silence that felt different from rest. Fatigue can make a person accept what she would challenge in daylight. The body wants bed, wants darkness, wants the temporary relief of sleep. She walked into that familiar space carrying the ordinary burdens of adult life, luggage, exhaustion, the weight of unresolved tension, and she did what most people do in that situation. She assumed morning would still exist in the same universe as the day before, but there are mornings that do not belong to the same universe. In the hours that followed, the home's quiet became a kind of cover, a way for the most devastating shift to occur without the world noticing. The children were upstairs, small bodies inside rooms designed for softness, blankets, stuffed toys, the tender clutter of early childhood. Their world was built on trust so absolute it is almost invisible. Children do not live with suspicion. Their safety is an assumption, not a calculation. The most unsettling element in this case is not that violence occurred. Violence occurs in the world. The unsettling element is the proximity of the perpetrator to the victims, the way the person who had been positioned as protector became the agent of disappearance. It turns the logic of the family inside out. It makes the role itself feel fragile, as if the title of husband or father can be worn like a costume even when the interior is hollowing out. By the time dawn approached, the decision had already translated itself into action. The garage door lifted. The vehicle was positioned. The items were loaded. The street's darkness absorbed the movement the way darkness always does, allowing the ordinary outlines of a morning departure to look like nothing more than routine. Out at the work site, the industrial landscape offered its own kind of anonymity. Wide sky, minimal human presence, the soundscape of machinery and wind. These are places built to contain substances that are not meant to be seen. Tanks, hatches, metal structures that hold what the world needs but does not want to look at directly. The environment itself is designed for concealment. In a mind that has begun to treat human beings as obstacles, such an environment can feel like an answer. The aftermath of that choice is carried first by the bodies that are missing, then by the people who discover the absence, then by the systems that move in to formalize it. Once the recoveries occur, the world is forced to hold the details in a particular way through evidence, through documentation, through the kind of language that makes the unbearable precise. Precision does not soften grief, it sharpens it. The legal process that follows has its own texture, one that is often misunderstood. People imagine it as a stage where truth is revealed in dramatic increments. In reality, it is a corridor with many doors, each one requiring a formal key. The worst truths do not arrive as climactic moments. They arrive as files opened, as photographs viewed, as descriptions read aloud in rooms where everyone is trying to maintain the minimum composure required to remain standing. Even when a case resolves quickly in the official sense, it leaves behind a long tail of consequences that are not official at all. There are the private consequences, families who wake up each day and remember again that the house is empty. There are the social consequences, communities that look at their own streets differently, as if the familiarity has been contaminated. There are the psychological consequences, the way people begin to scan the faces of ordinary men for signs that cannot reliably be seen. And then there is the perpetrator's consequence, which is not the romanticized punishment of fiction, but the slow reduction of a life into confinement. The fantasy that once seemed so vivid, the imagined new future, the clean slate, does not simply dissolve. It becomes grotesque in retrospect, because the only future available now is one measured in locked doors and regulated movement, and the endless repetition of days that will never open into anything new. In that environment, there is no longer any audience to persuade. There is no longer any performance that can restore what was taken. There is only the self, forced into proximity with itself. Confinement does not automatically produce insight. Sometimes it produces only endurance. The mind can survive by dulling. It can survive by refusing to look directly at what it has done. It can survive by treating the past as something distant, something that happened to a different person. Human psychology is capable of astonishing evasions when facing the weight of irreversible harm. And outside those walls, the world continues to revisit the story, partly out of fear, partly out of the desire to make meaning. People want a tidy explanation. They want a single label that captures what happened, because labels create distance. If the perpetrator can be classified as a monster, then he becomes separate from ordinary men. If he can be dismissed as uniquely abnormal, then ordinary life feels safer again. But the case resists that comfort. Not because it suggests that everyone is capable of the same act, but because it demonstrates how an outwardly ordinary life can contain a private drift toward annihilation without announcing it. It shows how a person can be seen for years and still remain unknown in the way that matters most. This is what leaves the deepest residue, not merely that a family was destroyed, but that the destruction occurred behind a mask that looked like routine. That a woman's future, carrying life, making plans, was extinguished in a space that still held children's toys and clean counters. That the children's trust, the most defenseless material in any household, was met with betrayal instead of protection. The mind returns to those rooms not because the rooms are special, but because they are so typical. A staircase that could belong to any home, a kitchen that could belong to any street, bedrooms painted and decorated with the hope that childhood will be long and safe. And then, inevitably, the mind returns to the early hour again because it was the hinge between worlds. The moment when the night still held the street in darkness, when the neighborhood's normal silence made concealment easy, when the garage door rose and the vehicle rolled out, routine used as a mechanism, familiarity used as camouflage, while upstairs, the rooms that had been made for small lives were already moving into a permanent quiet that no sunrise could undo. No sunrise could undo because sunrise is only light, and light is not restoration. When the day fully arrives, it does not arrive with an announcement of catastrophe. It arrives the way it always does, spilling across rooftops and windshields, polishing the familiar surfaces of the neighborhood until they look harmless again. The house sits there in that new light with the same symmetry it had the day before, the same clean lines, the same quiet promise of domestic order. From a distance, it is indistinguishable from every other structure on the street, but distance is a kind of mercy, and mercy does not last. The closer the world moves toward that home, the more the absence begins to behave like a physical substance. It fills the rooms without making a sound. It occupies the spaces where voices should be. It turns the ordinary into something that feels staged, not because the objects have changed, but because their owners are missing. A child's cup sits on a counter with the indifference of plastic and gravity. A blanket lies folded or thrown back. A small shoe rests where it was kicked off. These are not dramatic artifacts. They are the quiet residue of routine, and in the wrong context, routine becomes unbearable. In the modern era, grief does not begin with a body. It often begins with a gap in communication, a message unreturned, a call unanswered, a digital silence that arrives like a cold front. People who knew Shannon were conditioned to her presence, to her constant motion through the world, to her replies and updates and plans. The disappearance is not just physical, it is a sudden collapse in the pattern of her visibility. That visibility becomes, after the fact, both a map and a wound. Her life had been shared in a way that made it feel close to others, even those who knew her only at a distance. Images of her home, her children, her routines had traveled outward into a wider network. In ordinary times, that sharing is a kind of connection. In the aftermath, it becomes an archive. The public can move through her life as if walking through rooms, and that access creates the illusion of understanding while deepening the unease. Because the archive shows joy alongside strain, and strain alongside hope, and hope alongside the quiet indications that something was shifting behind the scenes. A marriage, when it begins to fail, rarely collapses all at once. It frays, it thins, it becomes porous. The two people still occupy the same physical space, but the emotional bond starts to leak away in small increments. A glance withheld, a touch avoided, a reply that arrives late and feels obligatory. The body may still perform its roles, work, parenting, chores, but the internal alignment that makes those roles meaningful begins to slip. When that slipping occurs under financial pressure, it takes on a particular sharpness. Money is not just currency, it is permission. It is oxygen. When oxygen is low, every decision becomes heavier and every conflict becomes less about the immediate subject and more about survival. The future feels narrower. The margins vanish. A person who feels trapped by obligation can begin to interpret everything through that lens, not as shared struggle but as confinement imposed. In such a state, an affair is not merely a betrayal. It becomes a story a person tells himself about escape. It becomes proof in his mind that he is still desirable, still capable of being wanted without demands. It becomes a private corridor to a different identity, one that feels lighter, less accountable. And because it feels lighter, it can begin to feel necessary. The more necessary the fantasy becomes, the more the original life begins to look like an impediment. That is where the danger lies, not in the existence of desire, which is human, but in the shift from desire as feeling to desire as entitlement. When a person begins to believe he is owed a new life, the people standing in the way of that life can start to appear less like loved ones and more like obstacles. Obstacles are easier to remove than loved ones. This is the quiet corrosion at the center of the story, the part that cannot be fully captured by timelines or records. The corrosion happens inside the mind while the outside continues. It happens while children laugh, while dinners are prepared, while photographs are taken. It is the internal separation between a person's outward role and his inward priorities. By the time the disappearance becomes public and irreversible, the internal separation has already been completed. That is why the early public performances feel wrong. They are attempts to inhabit a role that has already been abandoned internally. The face tries to arrange itself into concern. The words try to form the shape of desperation. But the body, when it is carrying a secret this heavy, does not always cooperate with performance. It shows tension where softness should be. It shows regulation where emotion should break through. As the official record hardens around the case, the story becomes less about what might have happened and more about what did, and the emphasis shifts to sequence. In a case built on disappearance, sequence is the spine. It is how the world translates absence into fact. Minute by minute, the night is turned into a corridor of cause and effect. The early morning departure, once a mundane act, becomes a hinge on which everything swings. After that hinge, everything else is consequence. There are those who must absorb that consequence not as spectators but as family. Parents who expected to watch their grandchildren grow up instead confront the permanent stillness of photographs. Their grief is not abstract. It is not theoretical. It is a bodily shock that does not resolve, because the mind cannot reconcile the existence of the children in memory with the knowledge of their removal. In the background of every procedural step, every document, every formal outcome, there are private rooms where people sit and stare and try to understand how the world has changed shape so quickly. There are kitchens where the air feels wrong because one expected voice will never enter again. There are bedrooms where sleep becomes impossible because the brain keeps replaying images it did not want, because it keeps trying to reverse time with thought alone. The public sees these people in fragments, glimpses, still frames, but their true experience is not cinematic. It is repetitive. It is waking and remembering, then remembering again, then realizing that remembering does not change anything. The systems surrounding the case continue forward because systems are built to continue. They reduce chaos into process. They take the raw material of human devastation and translate it into files, dates, determinations. They do not do this out of cruelty. They do it because without that translation, nothing can be established, and without establishment, nothing can be contained. Containment becomes the new theme, replacing domestic stability. Containment of facts, containment of the perpetrator, containment of the story into a narrative that can be recorded. But there are things that cannot be contained. There is the lingering question of how much was visible before the final night, and how much was hidden even from those closest. People revisit the old images not because the images can answer, but because the mind cannot accept the possibility that there were no reliable warning signs. If there were signs, then maybe the world is predictable. If there were signs, then maybe this can be prevented. If there were signs, then maybe the boundary between safe and unsafe is something one can learn to see. Yet the more the past is examined, the more it reveals a truth that is difficult to live with, that a person can appear ordinary while becoming internally estranged from empathy. That detachment can grow behind a familiar face, that domestic roles can be performed while their meaning is being hollowed out. The house, in the months after, becomes a kind of sealed object in the public imagination. People picture it empty. They picture the rooms untouched. They picture the staircase, the kitchen, the bedrooms, and they feel an almost irrational need to assign the space a personality, to treat it as if it holds echoes. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the human sense that certain places become saturated with what occurred there. An empty house is not merely empty, it is a refusal. It refuses to provide the ordinary sensory feedback of life, warmth, noise, movement, and in that refusal, it becomes a monument to what is missing. Meanwhile, the man who once moved through those rooms as husband and father is moved into a life where space is controlled and time is regulated. The fantasy that required removal collapses into a reality defined by limitation. Days become indistinct. The future stops being a field of choice and becomes a corridor. There are no mornings that belong to him. There are no nights that he controls. The self becomes, for perhaps the first time, inescapable. Yet even in that environment, the human mind remains capable of distortion. The story does not end simply because the perpetrator is contained. Containment is an external condition. The internal world can continue to rearrange itself, to shift blame, to search for narratives that reduce unbearable responsibility into something that feels survivable. This is part of why the case continues to radiate outward long after the official conclusion. People sense that the facts alone do not satisfy. The outcome is known, but the inner architecture remains partially obscured. What is it exactly that allows a person to look at the lives closest to him and decide they are negotiable? The question hangs not because it lacks an answer, but because the answer is not clean. It is made of many components: resentment that never found language, a desire for escape that became entitlement, a habit of compliance that concealed internal withdrawal, an infatuation that inflated fantasy, pressures that narrowed perception, and a final severing of empathy so complete that the victim's reality ceased to register as fully real. In the public imagination, the case becomes a kind of modern parable about surfaces: the surface of social media, the surface of suburban life, the surface of a calm demeanor. But beneath the surface is something more mundane and therefore more frightening: the slow accumulation of private decisions, the internal granting of permission, the quiet shift from imagining a different life to believing one has the right to take it at any cost. That shift does not happen in a single thunderclap. It happens in silence. It happens while the world continues, while work is done, while meals are eaten, while children are carried to bed, while plans are discussed, even as one person has already begun to treat the future as something he can unilaterally rewrite. The story remains heavy because it is not the story of a stranger who appeared out of darkness. It is the story of a familiar figure who lived inside the light of ordinary life and still moved toward an act that was final. And in the long echo that follows, after the street has returned to its routine, after new seasons have passed over the same roofs, after the house has stood through more mornings and nights, the central image persists not as spectacle, but as a quiet mechanism. A door lifting, a vehicle moving, a routine departure made extraordinary only by what it carried, and by the fact that the world, for a brief moment, did not yet know that a family's entire future had already been converted into absence. Into absence, and once absence becomes official, the world has to learn a new language for it. It begins with the simple, brutal administrative reality of recovery. What was once a search shifts into a sequence of controlled movements, locations secured, ground examined, objects handled with gloves and measured care. In ordinary life, the hand reaches out without thinking. In the aftermath of a disappearance, every touch is slowed, every motion burdened by the knowledge that nothing here is ordinary anymore. The air at the work site is open and raw, the kind of air that usually belongs to labor and weather, not to human endings. The metal structures stand still against the sky, and the horizon does not change to acknowledge what has been brought into it. In the hours when those places are examined, the industrial landscape feels almost indecently calm. It is a landscape built for containment, and in that sense it becomes a perfect accomplice. Tanks are designed to hold what cannot be left exposed. Hatches are designed to seal. The ground is designed to be driven over, used, ignored. There is no softness in the geometry, no features meant to invite pause. That absence of softness is part of what makes the location so coldly useful to a mind focused on concealment rather than consequence. Once the recoveries occur, the story's center of gravity shifts again. The focus is no longer on finding, it is on returning what can be returned. Returning bodies to families who have already been living in grief since the first unanswered message. Families who now must take grief into their hands in a different form, no longer uncertain, no longer suspended between hope and dread, but anchored in the unalterable fact of loss. There is a particular kind of silence that follows that anchoring. It is not the silence of surprise. It is the silence of a mind forced into alignment with something it had been resisting. the world becomes narrower. The future collapses into a blank space. Even the simplest thoughts, what to do tomorrow, what to cook, what errands need to be run, feel contaminated because the ordinary has continued while the irreplaceable has stopped. In the days that follow, the house is still there, and the contrast becomes almost unbearable. The interior remains arranged around a family that no longer exists. The children's rooms remain proportioned for small bodies. The kitchen remains proportioned for routine. Light still falls through windows onto counters and floors that now have no purpose. The architecture continues to offer the shape of normal life, and that offering feels like a kind of mockery, not intentional, not cruel in a human way, but cruel in the way that the physical world refuses to adjust itself to grief. The digital residue grows heavier as the case is assembled. Devices that once served domestic convenience become, in retrospect, witnesses. A phone holds movement and silence in the same memory. A timeline of calls and messages becomes a skeletal structure on which the narrative can be hung. In earlier eras, a private night could dissolve into rumor. Here it becomes a corridor of data points, arrival times, departures, deviations, the cold geometry of where a body was when it needed to be elsewhere. That geometry is one of the defining features of modern tragedy. It removes the possibility of a story drifting into ambiguity. It insists on sequence. It insists on location. It insists that events occurred in a particular order, regardless of how desperately the mind might wish for disorder, for confusion, for the chance that something could be reinterpreted into a less final shape. Once the narrative becomes that fixed, the legal corridor moves faster than the public expects, not because the case is simple in an emotional sense, but because the structure of admission closes doors that would otherwise remain open. The system's focus becomes containment, establishing responsibility, preventing further harm, converting chaos into a permanent record. The court does not exist to soothe, it exists to formalize. When the case reaches that stage, the atmosphere is dense in a way that cannot be captured in headlines. The room is not merely a room. It becomes a vessel for the collision between private devastation and public procedure. There is no need for spectacle. The weight is carried in posture, in the way people sit as if their bodies are doing the work of holding themselves together, in the way time drags even when the calendar moves quickly. The man at the center of it is no longer a husband making appeals. He is a defendant moving through a system that is indifferent to performance. The outward tools he once used, calm demeanor, controlled language, the ability to appear ordinary, do not function the same way here. This environment is built to resist persuasion. It is built to prioritize record. His life becomes a series of transfers and restrictions, a narrowing of autonomy that is as mechanical as any industrial process. And still, the mind does not settle. The public wants a clean internal explanation, a single cause that can be named and then dismissed. The affair is the simplest narrative handle because it is legible. Desire, betrayal, a split life. But the affair alone cannot fully account for the scale of removal because removal on this level requires something more than wanting. It requires permission granted internally, a belief, spoken or unspoken, that the lives of others can be treated as variables rather than as fixed realities. That permission is rarely sudden. It tends to be cultivated in silence through repeated mental rehearsals. A person begins to imagine a different life, then begins to imagine the steps required to reach it, then begins to imagine obstacles as things that can be moved. At first, the imagination is only fantasy, a temporary escape. Then it becomes planning. Then, if empathy continues to erode, it becomes logistics. In the Watts case, the logistics are what most disturb, not because they are elaborate, but because they are grafted onto routine. The work site is part of his ordinary week. The early departure is part of his ordinary life. The vehicle is familiar. The neighborhood expects him to leave at dawn. Nothing about the outward pattern screams danger until the pattern is reread through the lens of what the pattern contained. That is the kind of realization that does not fade with time because it is not confined to one street. It attaches itself to the general concept of familiarity. It suggests that routine can be weaponized, not through dramatic deviation, but through quiet continuity. After sentencing, the story should, in theory, settle into an ending. The legal system prefers endings. It prefers closure in the form of a date, a term, a location where the perpetrator will remain. But human stories do not end that cleanly. They do not obey the same desire for completion. The aftermath continues to move through families the way weather moves through a landscape, slowly reshaping what exists, carving out new contours. There are the immediate ripples, memorial services, the formalities of loss, the unbearable practical tasks that grief demands. There are the long ripples, the empty spaces in family trees, the missing birthdays, the holidays that arrive with their own cruel insistence on tradition. Even in families that are close, grief can isolate because each person carries it in a slightly different shape, and those shapes do not always fit together. The public, meanwhile, continues to revisit the story because it offers a kind of dark reassurance. If this can be understood, then maybe it can be controlled. People dissect behavior, study facial expressions, rewatch footage, map timelines again and again as if repetition might reveal a hidden code. The case becomes not just a tragedy, but an object of analysis, partly because the modern mind is uncomfortable with the idea that the interior life of another person can remain opaque, even when the exterior is visible for years. This ongoing analysis produces its own distortions. It can flatten the victims into symbols, reduce the perpetrator into a single dimension, treat the whole event as a puzzle rather than a human catastrophe. And yet beneath that flattening, there remains a core reality that cannot be made light by repetition. Two children whose world was small and dependent, a pregnant mother whose future was still being built inside her body, a domestic life that, for all its strain, still contained ordinary plans for the next week, the next month, the next year. Those plans are not just undone, they are erased, and erasure has a particular psychological violence. It leaves no gradual decline, no long illness, no time for the mind to practice loss. It replaces the expected narrative of life with a hard stop. In the longer tale of the story, even objects become charged. A family photo becomes unbearable to look at because it contains a future that never arrived. A child's toy becomes a relic, not because it is valuable, but because it belonged to a life that has been sealed off from continuation. Even the simplest domestic features, the stairs, the garage, the kitchen counter, take on a symbolic heaviness because they were the stage for a disappearance carried out without theatrical disruption. The home becomes a place where normality did not protect. And then, inevitably, the focus returns again to the man because he is still alive, still present somewhere in the world, contained but existing. People want to know what he feels, whether he understands, whether confinement has altered him, whether regret is possible, whether remorse exists in a form that is not merely self-pity. But these are questions that cannot be answered cleanly from the outside. A person can present compliance without insight. A person can endure without transforming. A person can survive by making the past smaller inside his mind, by turning it into something abstract and distant. Even the act of confession, once given, does not guarantee access to interior truth. Admissions can be factual without being psychologically honest. A person can say what happened and still not reveal what it meant to him in the moment, because revealing that would require facing the full weight of his own internal permission, the point at which he decided that other lives were negotiable. That internal permission is the darkest artifact left behind because it is not confined to a document or a timeline. It is a human capacity, and the knowledge of it lingers in the mind like a residue. The street in Frederick continues to exist. New seasons pass. Snow falls and melts. The trees change color and then return to green. Other families elsewhere wake up to the same kind of mornings, children asking for breakfast, parents checking their phones, the small chaos of ordinary life. And for most of them, routine remains what it is meant to be, a structure of safety. But in the shadow of this story, routine carries a second meaning, quieter and harder to name. It becomes a reminder that the visible surface of a life can conceal a private drift, that a person can appear stable while privately rearranging his loyalties, that the most decisive changes can occur without raising the temperature of a room. And in that reminder, the story does not end. It simply settles into the background of cultural memory like a permanent low light on the horizon, present, dim, inescapable, waiting to flare again whenever someone looks at an ordinary garage door lifting in the early dark and feels, for just a moment, the uneasy awareness that even the most familiar mechanisms can be used to carry something irreversible out into the day. Out into the day, and once that awareness exists, it does not vanish easily. It becomes a faint pressure behind the eyes, a new sensitivity to patterns that used to feel neutral, a departure before sunrise. A house too quiet in the middle of the morning, a spouse whose demeanor seems smoother than the circumstance should allow. These are not proof of anything in ordinary life, and yet the mind, once marked by this story, cannot help registering them as echoes. In the Watts case, the echoes are everywhere because so much of the prelude was ordinary. The family did not live at the edge of society. They lived inside the most recognizable framework of modern domestic aspiration. A newer house, a developing neighborhood, a life designed to look like progress. The children were small enough that their future felt endless. The third child, still unborn, made that future feel even more solid, even more inevitable. That inevitability is the lie the tragedy destroys. After the legal machinery closes around the perpetrator, the world expects the story to harden into a finished object, a case concluded, a sentence delivered, a file sealed. But the emotional architecture refuses to behave like that. A human life does not accept resolution simply because a system has completed its steps. Resolution is a procedural condition, not an internal one. For those left behind, the days begin to arrange themselves around absence as if absence were now a permanent resident. It occupies spaces in the calendar. It sits down at the table in the form of missing chairs. It moves through the house of memory, opening doors that lead nowhere. The mind tries at first to survive by narrowing focus. It concentrates on immediate tasks. It clings to the practical because the practical is controllable, and control is a thin kind of comfort. Arrangements, documents, the quiet rituals of loss that modern life requires. There is a formality to it all that can feel unreal, like acting in a play where the script has been written by someone who does not understand pain. Sign here, confirm this, decide that, choose what is impossible to choose. In that process, grief becomes both public and private at once. Public because the story is known, discussed, consumed. Private because no public attention can enter the innermost reality of what it means to lose a child, to lose a daughter, to lose a sister, to lose the future that was already being imagined in detail. The public may recognize the names, the private carries the textures. The scent of a child's hair after a bath, the particular way a small hand grips a finger. The habitual cadence of a loved one's steps on the stairs, the intimate inventory of a life that no longer has a living body to hold it. Meanwhile, the case continues to generate a secondary phenomenon that is uniquely modern, the relentless replaying of the narrative as if repetition can digest what happened. The home footage, the camera angle from the neighbor's house, the early morning movements that are so disturbingly normal. The public returns to those images again and again, not because the images change, but because the mind does. Each viewing carries a different hunger. At first, it is curiosity. Then it is suspicion. Then it is the need to locate the moment when reality tilted. But the tilt is not visible as a single frame. It is a whole atmosphere. The most unsettling feature of the case is that it does not present itself as a sudden eruption of a previously hidden monster. It presents itself as a man who appears capable of ordinary affection and ordinary routine, while internally something has been shifting toward cold utility. That coldness is what terrifies because it is not flamboyant. It is not theatrical. It is quiet. It is compatible with everyday life until it is not. In the wake of the case, people want to map that compatibility. They want to locate the cracks. They want to believe there were moments when the mask slipped in a way that would have been recognizable if someone had been wiser, more attentive, less trusting. The desire is understandable. It is a defense mechanism. If warning signs can be identified, then the world becomes less arbitrary. Then tragedy becomes a preventable event rather than an ambush. So the past is combed through. The language of old posts is weighed. The expressions in photographs are scrutinized. The cadence of domestic interactions is interpreted like a code. Ordinary marital tension is examined as if it were prophecy, but the past resists this kind of interpretation because most of it is simply life. It contains stress and affection, conflict and reconciliation, all the fluctuating weather of a household. What stands out in retrospect is not a single dramatic sign. It is a pattern of withdrawal, a thinning of emotional investment. A husband who begins to move through family life as if it is something to endure rather than something to inhabit. A father who becomes less present while still physically there. A man who begins to feel and then to act as if he is entitled to a future that does not include the obligations he has already accepted. Entitlement is a quiet force. It does not need to shout. It can sit inside a person's mind and slowly rewrite his perception of the people around him. It turns shared life into a ledger of grievances. It turns compromise into oppression. It turns the needs of others into an unreasonable demand. Under that internal rewrite, empathy can be narrowed until it becomes almost decorative, something performed rather than felt. And when empathy is reduced to performance, the performance can continue even as the internal reality becomes brutal. This is why the case continues to haunt the imagination, because the brutality did not require chaos on the surface. It required only a private collapse in the meaning of other lives. In the long shadow of the story, the home remains a central object, not because it holds secrets anymore, but because it is such a perfect emblem of the contradiction. Homes are built to protect. Their architecture is meant to create boundaries between the family and the world. The roof, the walls, the lock on the front door, these are the physical symbols of safety. But here, the danger did not come through the door. It was already inside. That inversion changes how a home is perceived, not only by those directly affected, but by anyone who takes the story seriously. It introduces the idea that the boundary between safety and harm is not always geographic. It can be relational. It can be psychological. It can exist in the space between two people who share a bed and yet inhabit entirely different internal worlds. The story also exposes something else that modern life often hides: how performance can replace intimacy. A family can appear close in photographs while being brittle in private. A marriage can present as stable while running on tension and silence. A person can smile for a camera while privately detaching from the people beside him. That capacity for performance is not, by itself, sinister. It is part of social survival. People present their best selves, they smooth over conflict, they preserve privacy. But in rare cases, performance becomes camouflage. It allows an internal drift toward harm to remain unseen. The legal outcome does not stop those thoughts. It only changes their setting. The man is removed from the ordinary world and placed into a space defined by restriction. The outside world imagines that restriction as a form of moral accounting, but confinement is not an emotional equation. It is a physical condition. It does not guarantee insight. It does not guarantee transformation. It simply removes choice and replaces it with schedule. In that environment, the self becomes louder. There are fewer distractions, fewer opportunities to escape into new roles. The body remains day after day in the same kind of light under the same kind of rules. Time becomes repetitive, a slow grinding down of novelty until the mind is forced to confront what it cannot outrun. Yet confrontation can be resisted, even in isolation. The mind is capable of building internal walls as sturdy as any prison. It can reduce, it can rationalize, it can split memory into parts, leaving some parts sealed away so that daily survival can continue. A person can endure by making the past feel distant, like an event observed rather than enacted. This resistance creates another kind of unresolved weight in the story. People want to believe that punishment includes understanding, that consequence includes an internal reckoning that matches the scale of the harm. But internal reckoning is not something the world can demand into existence. It is either there or it is not, and even when it exists, it may not take the form the public expects. So the story persists as a kind of static in the culture, an ongoing hum. It becomes a cautionary tale and a fixation, a reference point for the fear that the familiar can be false. It is invoked whenever another case resembles it even slightly, another family, another disappearance, another spouse whose outward calm feels wrong. And still, for the people closest to Shannon and the children, the case is not a cultural object. It is a permanent condition. It lives in their bodies. It changes their posture in the world. It shapes every future relationship with trust. It teaches the mind against its will that the worst outcomes can arrive from inside the circle that was supposed to be safe. In time, grief tends to stop being acute and become structural. It becomes part of the architecture of a person's life, like a wall that cannot be moved. The person learns to walk around it, to build routines that acknowledge it without constantly collapsing into it. But certain days remain sharp. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, ordinary milestones that now contain a void. The future that Shannon had planned becomes a collection of imagined scenes that will never occur. A newborn held in a home that no longer holds anyone. Children growing into school years that never arrive. The small transformations of time, first days, new teeth, lost teeth, scraped knees, winter coats, everything that belongs to the ordinary unfolding of family life becomes a list of absences. The tragedy is not only that those scenes will not happen. It is that, for a moment, they were inevitable. They were being prepared for. They were part of the mental landscape of everyone who loved the family. The disappearance did not only remove lives, it removed a whole future that had already been lived in anticipation. The house remains, and for a while it becomes an object that people cannot stop thinking about. Its rooms are empty, but in the imagination they are crowded with what used to be there. The mind fills them in automatically. A child's laughter in a hallway, a mother's voice calling from upstairs, the dull thud of a laundry basket on the floor. These are not supernatural hauntings. They are memory refusing to accept vacancy, and vacancy remains the final fact. The story circles again and again back to the same understated mechanism, routine as cover. A man leaving for work before dawn as he had left for work many times before, a neighborhood absorbing the motion without alarm. An industrial landscape receiving what it was never meant to receive, indifferent in its function. Everything about it is built from familiar pieces, and that familiarity is what makes the case linger. It suggests that the distance between ordinary life and catastrophe can be smaller than anyone wants to believe. The world continues because it must. But beneath the continuation, there is a subtle shift, a change in how safety feels. For those who carry the story in their minds, the morning can look the same and yet feel altered, because they now know how easily a familiar pattern can be used to conceal an irreversible act, and how quickly a home can become nothing more than an empty structure holding the shape of a life that is no longer there. No longer there, and the shape that remains is so familiar that it almost tricks the eye. A house without its people is not immediately dramatic. It does not collapse. It does not announce itself with broken windows or scorched walls. It simply sits intact, continuing to occupy its place in the world with the same quiet confidence it had when it held laughter and arguments and bedtime routines. That intactness is part of the injury. It suggests continuity where there is none. It offers the outline of a life without the life itself, like a shell left behind after something living has moved on. In the days and weeks after, the neighborhood continues to function because neighborhoods are built to function. Trash trucks still come. School buses still stop. People still pull out of driveways, still return with groceries, still walk dogs in the evening light. But the Watts home becomes an unspoken reference point, an address that carries a different gravity, a place people glance at in passing and feel their minds contract slightly, as if the street itself has developed a sensitive nerve. There is a peculiar contradiction that often follows a highly public tragedy. The broader world becomes saturated with details, while the immediate world becomes saturated with silence. Strangers know the names. They know the layout. They know the timeline. They know the look of the man's face in footage. But neighbors who live within sight of the house often speak less about it, because to speak is to make it present again. And presence is painful when what is present is the knowledge of what happened in proximity to your own door. The family's images remain because the modern world keeps images. They continue to circulate long after the bodies are gone. A photograph freezes a moment and then repeats it indefinitely, making the past feel more recent than it should. A child's smile remains unchanging even as time moves forward, and that permanence becomes its own kind of cruelty. The face remains young forever. The hair never grows, the expression never shifts into the next year because there is no next year. As the story becomes fixed in record, it also becomes fixed in a kind of collective attention that refuses to let it fade. It is studied and revisited not only because it is shocking, but because it sits so close to the ordinary. It suggests that the line between an intact household and a demolished one may be thinner than anyone wants to believe. It also suggests that the most decisive ruptures may be preceded by nothing that looks in real time like a clear warning. The temptation is to locate a single trigger, a single moment when everything could have gone another way. People reach for that because it offers the illusion of control. If a trigger can be isolated, then perhaps the outcome can be prevented in other cases. Perhaps tragedy becomes a matter of identifying the correct point and intervening. But human collapse rarely follows a clean equation. It is more like erosion. The visible surface of a life can remain intact while the foundation is being worn away in silence. In this case, the erosion appears to have involved not only strain and secrecy, but a particular kind of internal narrowing. A person's world can shrink until it contains only his own desire, his own discomfort, his own imagined future. Under that narrowing, the emotional reality of other people begins to lose its weight. Their suffering becomes abstract. Their presence becomes a pressure rather than a bond. Their needs become noise. The most chilling element is that this narrowing can occur while the person continues to perform normality. He can show up at work. He can lift a child